So this is a brief video on how to find common factors and how to factor binomials and monomials using common factoring. So before we get into that, just a quick review of GCF, which, if you recall, stands for greatest common factor. So that just means the biggest number, or sometimes with algebra, letter that goes into more than one term. So let's look at some examples here. For example, 24 and 36. What's the biggest number that goes into both 24 and 36? That would be 12. Now the next one is a little different because it has a combination of numbers and letters. So deal with the numbers first. What's the biggest number that goes into both of those? That would be 4. Now look at the letters. Is there a letter that's in common in both of them? In this case, there's an A in both, and there's a B in both. The C does not occur in both, and so that would not be a common factor. The third one down, again, let's deal with the numbers first. So 6 and 15. What is the biggest number that goes into both 6 and 15? That would be 3. Now, when you look at the letters, this one has an x squared, and remember, x squared means x times x. This one has x cubed, which means x times x times x. So both of them have an x times x in them, or an x squared. And so that would be a common factor. And then this last one, there's 3 terms. So now we have to look for numbers and letters that occur in all 3. So what is the biggest number that goes into both 10, 15, and 20? And that would be 5. Now let's look at the letters individually. This one has an x, this one has an x, but this one does not, so that is not a common factor. This has a y squared, this has a y to the 5, and this has a y to the 1. And so the smallest one that they have in common is the y, or y to a 1. This is z to the 4, z to the 3, and z to the 2. So the smallest one they have in common is z to the 2. And so those are examples of finding common factors with algebraic terms. So now let's look at how that applies to common factoring. So when you are factoring, essentially what you do is you find the greatest common factor of all the terms. So you do what we just did, and then all you do is you divide each term by the greatest common factor, and you will end up with something that is factored. So for example, let's look at 3x minus 9. The first question you need to ask yourself is, what's the greatest common factor? In this case, the greatest common factor is 3. So now what you're going to do is you're going to divide both 3x and negative 9 by that greatest common factor. So 3x divided by 3, you'd be left with x, and negative 9 divided by 3, you'd be left with negative 3. And so now to write that in factored form, you put the GCF first, you open up a bracket, and then you put the result of each division. And then you close a bracket. So your answer in factor form would be 3 bracket x minus 3. Now you can check your answer if you want. So over here we're just going to check it. So we can check it by expanding, by doing distribution. So 3 times x is 3x. 3 times negative 3 is negative 9. And if you get the question back, which in this case we did, the original question was 3x minus 9, and that's what we got, then we know we've factored it correctly. So let's look at some more examples. So let's look at this first one. Again, the first question you ask yourself is, what is the common factor? In this case, it is 5. So put that first and open up a bracket. Now take the first term, 5x, and divide by 5. What would you be left with? You would be left with an x. Now take the second term, negative 10, and divide by 5, and you'd be left with negative 2. And that is your answer in factored form. Let's do the same for the next one. The next one's a little bit more complicated. So again, we look for a common factor. First, let's deal with the numbers. In this case, a 2 goes into both, and it's always a good idea if there is a leading negative coefficient to factor that out. So we're going to factor out negative 2, and let's look if there's any letters in common. So they both have an x. This one's an x squared, which remember is x times x, and this has an x. So that would be the common factor. Open up a bracket. So what is negative 2x squared divided by negative 2x? You'd be left with an x. What is 8xy divided by negative 2x? Be careful with this one. Positive 8 divided by negative 2, you'll be left with negative 4, and in this case, y. Another thing that you should do when you're common factoring is check what you have left in the bracket. Is there still a common factor there? If so, then you didn't pick a greatest common factor when you factored. In this case, when I look what's left, there's no longer anything in common between x and 4y, so I know I've gone all the way. So let's look at a couple more examples. So this next one, again, is getting a little bit more complicated. So again, first, look at the numbers. 14 and 21, 7 is in common. Now let's look at the letters. We have an a squared and an a, so they have an a in common. And we have a b to the 4 and a b to the 2. So there's a b to the 2 in common. Now we need to divide. And if it's too complicated to do it in your head, just show it. So what's 14a squared b to the 4 divided by 7ab squared? You'd be left with 2ab2. Because remember, when you divide, you're using the division rule and you subtract exponents. So this would be 2ab squared. And again, if you need to for this one, write it out. Be careful with this one because you've got a negative. So negative 21 divided by 7 is negative 3. And in this case, the a's cancel out and the b's cancel out. And that would be your final answer. Now again, you can expand that and check if you got it right. 7 times 2 is 14. A times a is a squared. B squared times b squared is b to the 4. And so you can check, did I do it correctly? So let's look at this very last one, and this one is the most complicated one. There are 3 terms. So again, you have to make sure that you find a common factor that works for all 3. So in this case, start with the numbers. 6 goes into all 3. Then deal with the letters. They all have x's, and the smallest one is x squared. And then look at the letters. We have a y4, a y, and a y cubed, so the smallest one is a y. And then divide each term. 24 x cubed y4, you'd be left with 4x y cubed. Again, if you need to write it out, write it out. Negative 18 divided by 6, you'd be left with negative 3. X squared divided by x squared, that cancels. Y divided by y, that cancels. And then this very last one, 12 divided by 6 is 2. X to the 4 divided by x to the 2 is x to the 2. And y cubed divided by y is y squared. And that would be your final answer. And again, you can check, is there anything left in common? No, so you know you've done it right. Just one caution. If you were doing something like, let's say, 2x squared minus 36x cubed, for example. In this case, your common factor would be 2x squared. So you put that out front and then you open up a bracket. Be really careful here. 2x squared divided by 2x squared is not 0, it is 1. And so you have to put the 1 there. So be really, really careful. The number of terms that you had at the beginning, that's how many terms you should have in your bracket. So just watch out for that. That if something cancels completely out, the answer would not be 0, it would be 1.